Hey everyone, Anarch here, and today I'm going to be taking the 8 Values political quiz. The 8 Values political quiz is actually one of the better political quizzes out there, so I'm hoping that it will have plenty of options for someone who is an anarchist, because if you're new around here, my name is Daniel and I am an anarchist. This channel focuses mostly on leftist political theory and philosophy, and if that sounds interesting to you, you should stick around after the intro, because that's what we're going to be talking about today. I hope you like the intro. I made it myself. This is the first video I've put it in. On any occasion, I did have to buy new assets in order to make that, and if you want to help me have the money to buy assets for the channel, such as cameras and mics and lighting and video assets like the ones you saw there in the intro, then you should go over to my Patreon and become a patron for any amount. As a reward, you'll get access to the Anarch Discord, where we have all kinds of discussions about political theory and history and praxis and everything in between. Also, if you stick around and you watch the channel, you get to watch the cats fighting in the background. Anyway, without further ado, let's begin the quiz. So the 8 values are discussed here down below. And you can see that these are sort of counterposed values. The opposite of equality is markets. The opposite of nation is the globe. The opposite of liberty is authority. The opposite of tradition is progress. You know, there's probably a lot we could take apart in these presumptions, but we're just going to skip past that as for this video and get on to answering the questions. So it says, you will be presented with a series of statements. For each one, click the button with your opinion on it. So we are going to be presented with 70 questions, and we're going to be asked to strongly agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree. Here, the very first one, question 1 of 70 is, oppression by corporations is more of a concern than oppression by governments. So this one's complicated for me. As an anarchist, I'm opposed to all hierarchical power structures, and corporations are hierarchical power structures, and governments are hierarchical power structures. So when I read this question, it's sort of hard to give them an answer, because both of these are important premises to a society of oppression. Now, here I suppose I should probably bite the bullet, because it's just asking me which one is more of a concern. Well, I think in modern society, given that we live in a capitalist society, corporations essentially control our governments. And that means that corporations, in a general sense, have more power than governments all by themselves, as governments really rely on those corporations to a significant degree in order to generate tax revenue, whereas corporations mostly rely on the governments in order to do violence to protect their private property. That being said, I do think that this one is very difficult for an anarchist to answer, because the anarchist opposes both. But if I were asked to weigh in on which of these two is more of a concern, I think that the anarchist position is that corporations are slightly more of a concern than governments, because in a general sense, you could abstract the concept of government and you could imagine a governance by the people, a directly democratic government that would be much more horizontal. Corporations, however, cannot be reimagined. The corporation is inherently a hierarchical power structure. There's really no wiggle room there. And as I said, in modern society, corporations have an enormous amount of control over our governments. So it's very difficult to discern where one ends and the other one begins. That being said, I will give just an agree here because, as I've expressed, I kind of have some complicated feelings about this question. Question 2 of 70 is, it is necessary for the government to intervene in the economy to protect consumers. So this one, I think, is asking us to consider the world as it is. That is to say, there isn't going to be much of an anarchist sentiment to this question, because most anarchists are going to agree that we want to abolish what they are probably calling government here, that is to say, the state. However, given that we are in this current structure, yes, the government should intervene in the economy to protect consumers because corporations have enormous control over our lives. Corporations, if they are left to their own devices, are just going to exploit the people. They're just going to extract more and more labor value out of the average worker. They are going to give us lower and lower quality products. Those products are going to be less and less healthy. Those products will be marketed to us through deceptive advertising practices. We will be made more and more into captive consumer audiences, and will be made more and more into slaves by those corporations. So the government, its only really valuable purpose in a capitalist economy is to intervene in the economy to protect consumers. So strongly agree. The freer the markets, the freer the people. I think this is absolutely false. The freer the markets does not mean the freer the people, because the people are not the corporations. The corporations are enormous hierarchical power structures. They are multinational. They are ruled by a very small group of people that have the largest incomes, therefore the most vested interest in defending those corporations from any sort of regulation or oversight. And therefore, the freer the markets is really the freer the ability of those hierarchical structures to barbarically plunder society. We'd be looking at a society like a cyberpunk world. Well, that is optimistic, I suppose. I think what we would really get is an enormous constellation of company towns that are ruled over by corporations, where people are not even allowed to change their employers, where they are given a pittance of a wage in company scrip that they are only allowed to even spend at the company store. This is the eventual outcome of perfectly free markets that have absolutely no oversight by any governmental entity or any sort of citizen oversight. So it is absolutely, completely false that the freer the markets, the freer the people. So I strongly disagree. Question 4 of 70 is, it is better to maintain a balanced budget than to ensure welfare for all citizens. This one is wrong in a lot of ways. First of all, we have operated at enormous deficits for a very long time now, and it generally has very little actual outcome on the welfare of the citizens. I know that there are a variety of mechanisms that are claimed to be related to government deficits, but if one actually inspects the data, they will see that most of those claimed problems are not really problems that show up. Now, I could be talking about this from the privilege of being in the United States, which is the world hegemon, and so therefore nobody can really call us on our debts. But living in the United States, it does not seem that it is particularly important for us to maintain a balanced budget, especially when we could be spending to ensure the welfare for all citizens. In fact, people who believe in modern monetary theory don't even believe we need to worry about this problem. Since we print the money, we don't have to worry about balancing the budget. Obviously, I think there's probably some breaking point to this principle, but it seems like if nobody is calling you on your debt, which we have essentially a world system where governments are borrowing enormous amounts of money and not calling each other on their debts, then the better thing to prioritize is the welfare of your citizens. Of course, you can do both, and many nations do. However, I would say it is not nearly as important to maintain a balanced budget as it is to ensure the welfare of all of your citizens. That is the highest value for a government, to ensure welfare for its citizens. Now, whether governments actually achieve that or not, that I would say they do not. However, if a government does exist, that is to say the state is what I mean here, then absolutely its highest priority should be ensuring welfare for the citizens. So strongly disagree. Question 5 of 70 is publicly funded research is more beneficial to the people than leaving it to the market. This one is not a matter of opinion. It is strongly agree. Everything we have seen is that government funding goes to more neutral, unbiased funding of grants than private funding does. It leads to more innovation. It leads to more first generation research, as I say, research that is on new things. It is on foundational topics. Whereas research that is funded by private entities tends to only be research which would benefit those private entities. So, for example, we actually did have a pretty good private lab for quite a while called Bell Labs. Bell Labs made some pretty important discoveries in physics. However, as time went on, that lab really just became a sort of excess that the corporation did not really want to maintain, and so they closed it down. Why is it that corporations are able to do this? Well, because they exploit the actually impactful research that is done by governments. The research that is funded by the state is research that everyone benefits from, including the corporations. So, under the system we are given, it is absolutely not the case that if we left it to the market, things would be okay. The market does not care about astronomy or astrophysics or cosmology or theoretical physics. It doesn't care about any of that if that does not lead to higher and higher profits. And it is very difficult to explain to a corporation why they should plan for the future, because corporations are inherently short-sighted entities that only care about right now. The role of the state, theoretically at least, is that it is supposed to think about the long term, and it is supposed to invest in long-term research that is going to keep the state and the corporations on the cutting edge, able to develop new things to maintain a steady progress for society. Now, as I've said before, I'm an anarchist, so I don't think that this arrangement is the necessary arrangement for society, but given the society we've got, publicly funded research is in every way more valuable than privately funded research. And that is because there is barely any privately funded research. So, anyway, strongly agree. Question 6 of 70, tariffs on international trade are important to encourage local production. So this one I have complicated feelings about. That is to say, tariffs on international trade can be good precisely to encourage local production, but it's very easy to go overboard. And I think Trump has given us all a demonstration of this fact. So if you try to create complete national autonomy, well, what this generally leads to is a suffocated economy. Under capitalism, you essentially have to interact with the rest of the globe in order to maintain a rate of growth as the rest of the globe. So those who go overboard on national protectionism are going to generally be those who fall behind. So tariffs on international trade are very fiddly. It's something you have to be very careful about. They have to be very well considered, and you should listen to experts. Trump doesn't seem to care about listening to experts, so he has been misusing the tariff. But I don't think that it is always necessarily bad to put tariffs on international goods in order to favor the industry that is there in the nation. I think, once again, insofar as the state continues to exist, this can have a beneficial effect, and it can put some pressure on your domestic corporations to not outsource all of your labor or take all of those profits that they made and build their factories elsewhere. So I'm not against the concept of tariffs, but they can obviously be misused. So here, I'm just going to put, I guess I'm kind of like neutral here, but I'm usually try to avoid answering neutral because it kind of seems like it's a cop-out. All it really does is just give you kind of gray in a lot of these tests. It just gives you like this wiggle room where things just don't add up to 100% anymore. So I'm just going to put agree. And we'll move on to question 7 of 70. We're about 10% through the quiz. From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. So I strongly agree with this one. This is another one of those where I don't really have to do too much thinking before I answer it, because this is one of the fundamental tenets of my belief system, and that is that we should have an economy where things are produced by the people who have the ability to produce them, and things should be distributed to those who need them, and that should be the fundamental organizing ethos of the economy. Now, that is sometimes easier said than done, but in my view, that is the ideal mechanism for economic arrangement. I will justify that quite simply. In a society where those who produce are doing so according to ability, you have the experts doing production, and where those who are receiving are those who need those things, then you are in a situation where people who need the goods are the ones who receive them. So you don't ever have a society where somebody who just has more wealth receives the bread before the people who are starving. You never end up in a situation where those who are thirsty don't get water because some enormous corporation or some wealthy magnate gets the water first. The wealthy magnate does not need the water as much as the person who is currently dying from thirst. Next question, question 8 of 70. It would be best if social programs were abolished in favor of private charity. So I feel like I've given my reasoning as to why this one is absolutely false beforehand. And that is, corporations really cannot be trusted to deal with the basic social safety nets of society. One of the big reasons is just a conflict of interest. Corporations want people to be deprived very deeply. Corporations want people to basically be on the edge of starvation, the edge of homelessness, the edge of dying of thirst, alone and atomized. And that is because that is the ideal worker. That is the person who will do labor asking for the least remuneration for that labor. And so, with that in mind, corporations really cannot be trusted to be the charitable entities of society. Instead, if the state does exist, then it is better for the state to do so because the state has an interest in maintaining the health of its people. Also, I should note this question just says social programs. It does not say, state-run social programs. So it seems to me that we could conceptualize that these social programs are taking place in a society of, decentralized, federated workers' councils or neighborhood councils or whatever it is, working together in order to provide what people need, which would generally be provided by the social programs we have in mind. So here I'm going to say strongly disagree. Question 9 of 70. Taxes should be increased on the rich to provide for the poor. Yeah, I am deeply anti-capitalist. Insofar as that the state and capital continue to exist, I want them to be locked in battle as much as possible because they actually have the most interest in fusing with one another. That is to say, the corporations actually have the most interest in just absorbing the functions of the state. The only reason they don't is because they do not want to deal with the use of violence. They do not want to deal with maintaining the courts. They just want to be able to rig the courts anytime they like. They just want to be able to avoid being penalized by law anytime they like. But they like the existence of law and courts and all of that because those are the mechanisms by which the people are kept suppressed. But insofar as the state and corporations remain not separate, but in a situation where there could even be tensions, where there could even be disagreements, we should hope to see the state enormously diminish the power of corporations. So we would want to see taxes raised to a huge degree on the rich and corporations in order to fund the needed social programs of the people who are being exploited by those corporations and rich people. So taxes should be increased on the rich to provide for the poor. Strongly agree. Question 10 of 70. Inheritance is a legitimate form of wealth. Well, I disagree. I do not think that inheritance is a legitimate form of wealth, especially under a capitalist system. One of the fundamental ethos of a capitalist system is the idea that it is a meritocracy, that people are pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and earning more and more. However, inheritance spits in the face of that concept. If there is any value to that concept under capitalism, inheritance is against everything that concept represents. Just because you were born to someone who worked very hard under capitalism does not mean that you should have the wealth that they earned. You did not work very hard. So it really doesn't make a lot of sense in the capitalist system under the capitalist ethos. Now, I would like to see a system, of course, where everybody has what they need, and therefore we wouldn't even have very much wealth accumulation because there just wouldn't be much to get out of it. And in that sense, inheritance would be pretty harmless, and I really wouldn't care much about it. However, in the system we've currently got, where capital essentially allows you access to all of the halls of power, where it allows you to put your hands on every lever that is a mechanism for the exertion of power, then it seems to me that we should have a 100% inheritance tax, and all of that should be funneled straight into social programs. So inheritance is not a legitimate form of wealth. Strongly disagree. Question 11 of 70. Basic utilities like roads and electricity should be publicly owned. Yes, agreed, insofar as that we continue to have a capitalist society with a separation of the state and capital, which once again, I could problematize that notion. I think that they are very intertwined, but insofar as that we still live in this society, this is another one of those things where we all have a vested interest in those being controlled by someone who does not profit from gouging us over those things. We all need a baseline access to roads because we have to be able to go from place to place and access all of the locations which allow our life to function. And we all need electricity because in the modern world, everything runs on electricity. Everything is electrified now. You cannot go about a normal life in the modern world without some form of electricity. And I know maybe people are thinking about extreme examples otherwise, but those are extreme examples for a reason. Everybody lives in an electrified society now, and therefore electricity should just be a baseline for everybody in society, the same way that transportation should just be a baseline for everybody in this society. So once again, as we've discussed, the state has more of a vested interest in providing those baseline necessities to society than corporations do, because the state does not profit from giving those amenities to people, whereas the corporation desires to profit from everything, and therefore it is going to gatekeep any asset it gets its hands on, and the more scarce or more needed that thing is, they're going to gouge people harder and harder and harder for that. If you don't agree, you should just look into turnpikes. So yes, strongly agree. Here, I could also conceptualize public ownership as being a form of horizontal communal ownership, in which case I would even more strongly agree. Question 12 of 70, government intervention is a threat to the economy. So here we have sort of this ANCAP libertarian conception of the world, that government is what is preventing the economy from doing better. But this is just an absolute falsehood. In fact, one of the most idiotic parts of capitalism is that all of these corporations, they sort of resent the government for regulating them and taxing the rich and so on. But these are precisely the mechanisms that prevent capitalism from exploding. It's just like you have all of these mechanisms in an automobile to make sure that all of this combustion energy does not just blow up components of the car. So you actually need to have the government there to regulate industry so that it does not go wildly out of control, so that it does not have crises of overproduction or underproduction, or doesn't engage in false advertising, or doesn't engage in extreme price gouging. These are all things that the economy would engage in quite naturally if it were not somehow held back. So government intervention is not at all a threat to the economy. In fact, it is necessary for the economy not to explode and undergo cyclic crises. Question 13 of 70. Those with a greater ability to pay should receive better health care. This one just really goes against the basic concept of healthcare. The whole idea of healthcare is that it is meant to ameliorate people's sicknesses, their natural bodily ailments. And the idea that just because somebody has more money, that they should have more of a right to ameliorate those bodily ailments, it really contradicts the basic notion of what health providers are supposed to be doing. So it seems to me that healthcare is another one of these things that should just be provided baseline to everyone. And there should be no prioritizing of people based on their money. There should only be prioritizing of people based on the severity of their sickness and their immediate need for care. So this one, to me, is just completely inhuman and ineffective. This is what we have in the United States, and it is notoriously ineffective. We have one of the worst healthcare systems on the face of the planet. It is worse than many third world countries. Many of us get no access to care. Many of us cannot visit a hospital unless we want to go to an emergency room where we will pay thousands of dollars to access that emergency room. It is extremely difficult to get an appointment with a doctor. When you get a doctor, they are not even able to give you the medication that you need a lot of the time because you have to go through middlemen, health insurers. This is a disastrously failed healthcare system. And so those with the greater ability to pay should not receive better healthcare. Question 14 of 70. Quality education is a right of all people. So here we see a recurring aspect of what I've been talking about, and that is there are some things that a society should just provide baseline to the people that live in it. There should just be baseline necessities provided for without any need to work for them. And education is one of those things. And it's not only from a purely humanistic standpoint that we want people to be educated because being educated is good for them, although that's a strong motivating factor. It's also that if you want a society where the people are able to make decisions and able to intervene in the affairs of governing society, then you need an educated populace. This educated populace is able to actually come up with good ideas. It is able to propose its own legislation. It is able to criticize bad legislation. And furthermore, it is able to pick out when someone is a charlatan, when someone is lying to them. If they have poor education, they are just going to be bowled over by snake oil salesmen, as we see here in America with the MAGA movement. These people are just being deeply deceived by all of these Republicans in government. They are unfortunately not educated enough to see how that the promises of these fascists in positions of government are just false. I mean, the anti-vax movement is a great example. There is no good reason to be anti-vaccine. Anybody who is educated knows the vaccines are possibly one of the most wondrous discoveries in human history. They prevent enormous numbers of people from dying. They are a miracle discovery. So the right wing, because it is inherently based in eugenics and wants to see mass die-offs so that they can get this sort of eugenic outcome of killing the weak and defenseless, that's why they are discouraging vaccines. They will feel the impact ultimately insofar as that their populace will be made sicker and less able to fulfill these fascist fantasies of heroism. However, they will also get people to be confused and to act against their own best interest. And they will even get them apparently to be angry at the very people who are trying to get them to prevent themselves from being made sick, from being debilitated by a variety of diseases. And this comes from a lack of good education on the topic. So when you have an ignorant populace, that populace is far more susceptible to fascist ideas and also the takeover of tyrants, as we see in the United States. So yes, quality education is a right of all people. 15 of 70, the means of production should belong to the workers who use them. Once again, this one is a tenet of my ideology, and that is to say the workers should own the means of production. This is what I would say is the description of socialism. I am a socialist. And so what I believe in is the workers having direct ownership and decision-making power over the means of production. I do not believe in the state owning the means of production instead of the workers. I do not believe in this form of intermediary control. I believe that the only form of true control is control by the people. And so, yes, the means of production should belong to the workers because the workers are the ones who make everything in society. Without the workers, there wouldn't be a society. Without the rich, we'd be fine. I mean, what? CEOs go on vacation all the time. Like, if you've ever worked in a massive corporation and you are just going about your day-to-day business, coming into work, clocking in, working, clocking out, do you ever know when the CEO is on vacation? Because I would wager you have no idea what the CEO is doing. The CEO could literally have been on vacation the entire time you were at that job and you never would have noticed. And that's because the CEO is really not doing a very vital thing within the corporation. The workers, being the majority participants and contributors to the success of the economy, should be the ones who therefore own the means of production, the outcome of that economic labor, and make decisions about the means of production. So absolutely, strongly agree with this. Number 16 of 70, the United Nations should be abolished. So this one is weird because a lot of these answers, like I've noted in the previous time I took the quiz, it's hard to answer about like what I think right now as opposed to what I would think in an alternative world. But I would say here, I think it's not too difficult because something like the United Nations would exist in a world I would envision. So I would say no, the United Nations should not be abolished. The United Nations is a way for all of the nations of the earth to hold each other accountable, at least theoretically. And in an alternative world where everything had gone right after a revolution, we would have a global confederation, we would hope. And so, no, the United Nations should not be abolished. Question 17 of 70. Military action by our nation is often necessary to protect it. Of course, this one, in my opinion, is, if it didn't say often, would just be a no-brainer. Military action by any distinct group or region will be necessary to protect it at some point on a long enough timeline. However, I don't think that that necessarily justifies aggressive military action, foreign intervention, and the meddling in the affairs of other places on Earth. So I think this one I will disagree because it says often. I think that's the problem here. However, I think it's very contextual. Depends on what nation you are, right? You know, the United States doesn't really need to be meddling in the rest of the world. It does that because it wants to exert power and because it's really just trying to look out for its own interest. And it wants to maintain complete hegemonic control and domination over all the other nations of the planet. So the United States military certainly is not intervening in a sense to protect us. If anything, it is the reason why we experience terroristic blowback like 9/11. However, other nations, that's harder to say. Other nations are the ones on the receiving end of that military violence. And so for those nations, yes, they absolutely are going to have to engage in military action to protect themselves. So military action by our nation is often necessary to protect it. Strongly disagree. However, I feel like that might give the quiz the wrong idea about my views, about my ideas. So I'm trying to answer in a way such that the quiz will actually kind of assess my viewpoints. I'm hoping it'll come out accurate. And I think if I put strongly disagree, it'll think I'm like a pacifist or something, right? And if I strongly agree, it will think that I am like a bellicose, that I'm like very militant, that I think we should be like imperialist or something. So this one's a difficult one. I am going to put disagree, not strongly disagree, so that hopefully I don't mess up my results too much. Question 18 of 70. I support regional unions such as the European Union. Yes, I also support regional unions. I support unions at all scales. So just in the same way that I was answering that I would like to, in the very far future even, see something like the United Nations, I would like to see something like the European Union and the North American Union and the Central and South American Union, and that these inside of them would have many smaller unions and so on. This is the principle of confederation or federation, depending on, what school of thought you're coming from. So here I would say I strongly agree. I support the EU. 19 of 70. It is important to maintain our national sovereignty. Well, I don't really care about the national sovereignty of the United States. The United States really ultimately needs to be dismantled. It is an imperial world power that is doing enormous amounts of damage all over the planet, that is funding genocides of all kinds. It is in every way a villainous actor, and its intervention in world affairs is really just broadly villainous. It is damaging to the progress of humanity. So it's hard for me to argue that I really care about the national sovereignty of one of the most villainous entities on the face of the planet. The problem here is this word "our," right? I'm not saying that other nations don't have a good reason to try to maintain their national sovereignty when when the enemy is trying to imperialize them. However, as somebody living inside the imperial hegemon, it is hard for me to argue that the imperial hegemon should maintain its national sovereignty. So this is another one of those where I'm basically just trying to figure out what to answer, not to mess up my results, because I think it'll be confused by my actual opinion. It is important to maintain our national sovereignty. I'm just going to put neutral. Question 20 of 70. A united world government would be beneficial to mankind. Well, I certainly can't say that as a blanket statement. There is all kinds of very negative dystopian possible outcomes of a united world government, but there are also utopian possibilities of a united world government. I certainly do believe in a federation of directly democratic council structures that spans the entire planet. So one might call that a united world government. However, there are also forms of fascist dystopian dictatorship that would span the entire planet. If the current United States were to control the whole planet, it would absolutely not be beneficial to mankind. In fact, it would lead truly to the degradation of humankind and the destruction of the planet. So I certainly cannot say that a united world government just would be beneficial to mankind. However, there are versions of a united world government structure, not a state, but a structure of the people making decisions of themselves that would be beneficial to mankind. This one is really confusing because I'm not sure if saying yes, that it will think I am a statist. And if I say no, it might think that I am a nationalist. So this one is very odd, and is another one where I'm just trying to figure out how to answer, not to mess up my results, because once again, my answer is kind of nuanced, right? So I'm going to just put agree. I'm just going to put agree so that maybe it doesn't go too hard on statism and it doesn't mess up and think that I am just like all about national interest or something. Question 21 of 70. It is more important to retain peaceful relations than to further our strength. Yeah, this is absolutely the case. Because if you have peaceful relations, it's really not super relevant whether you are strong. Cultivating strength, it's not a bad thing in and of itself. But strength is used for defense. It is used for offense. And insofar as we are talking about global affairs, getting more and more strength in a general sense is really about being able to defend yourself if things get bad. But in the situation we're discussing here, we're trying to cultivate peaceful relations. So if I get to choose, I have a button that says retain peaceful relations and another one that says become stronger. Well, in a general sense, it is better to retain peaceful relations. That creates a society of more cooperation. That creates a society where we are going to work out our differences through diplomacy rather than military action. So I would say in a general sense, yes, we want globally more peaceful relations, less cultivation of strength. Just pure focus on the cultivation of strength leads to warfare. So I would say, yes, it is more important to retain peaceful relations than to further strength. However, I should offer a caveat, and that is, insofar as that there comes a time where we have the strength in this nation or any other nation to overthrow the system as it stands, to undergo revolution and to put in place a new society, that is preferable than just maintaining peace with the existing system. So this question is difficult to answer because there's lots of aspects to this. There's lots of things to consider. I would say agree. Question 22 of 70. Wars do not need to be justified to other countries. Yeah, no, I mean, this is absurd. I mean, given everything that I've told you so far, I think that you can probably infer why I would disagree with this. Wars are not something that are only of interest to the nation that is waging them, right? Wars lead to mass death. They lead to the deprivation of enormous numbers of people, the destruction and dismantling of people's democratic structures. Wars do need to be justified to other countries because you do indeed need the consensus of other countries to determine whether what you are doing is legitimate or whether it is just a form of tyrannical imposition. So I think that it is very dangerous to imagine that every nation would just go around starting wars with other countries without regard to whether it is justified or can be justified to the other nations of the earth. So this one, absolutely not. Wars do need to be justified to other countries, so strongly disagree. Question 23 of 70. Military spending is a waste of money. In a general sense, I agree with this. I think that especially living in the United States, where our military spending is excessive, it is many nations' military spending added together, and that we don't even have basic health care, our infrastructure is falling apart, people do not have maternity or paternity leave, we do not have many of the basic amenities that other societies do. Money is being wasted on our military. It is absolutely a terrible use of our money. And the only reason why we do not pull back on that spending is because the government is bought by more corporations, the military-industrial complex. And furthermore, because imperialism is profitable to the United States, it is profitable not only to the state itself, but to the economy. And so this creates a perverse incentive to keep spending on military, even though most of us do not benefit. I am not the military-industrial complex. I do not benefit from the state continuing to buy missiles from Raytheon. So military spending absolutely is a waste of money. Strongly agree. Question 24 of 70. International aid is a waste of money. No, I don't think this one's true on a variety of fronts. I don't think that international aid is a waste of money, even if you are a tyrannical government. Because international aid is essentially a form of bribing other countries to agree with you. This is a form of soft power. So if you are some enormous state that wants to control the world, and you don't only want to do it through domination, because that's kind of costly, then international aid is a great way to control other countries. You go to those countries, you say, hey, what's the problem that you're facing here? And they say, oh, we have problems with AIDS or teen pregnancy or whatever it is, right? And you say, all right, well, as a show of good faith, I'm going to ship you a bunch of condoms, or I'm going to ship you the best, AIDS medication that the world has to offer. This gets that nation in your pocket. it means that that nation's probably not going to try to screw with you. Not maybe those specific examples, those are just examples, but the more that you do this, the more that that nation is going to want to help you and not your enemies. So international aid is a form of soft power. If you want to maintain an empire, international aid is a part of running that empire. That is just the cynical logic even. But even from a non-cynical perspective, I don't really care about my national boundaries. I do not care about the United States as a discrete political entity. Not the government, at least. I care about the people. I care about the land. I want the best world for as many people as is conceivably possible. And that world is not going to come about unless a nation like the United States, which has way too much money for its own good. Sorry, the cat got in my way. Too much money for its own good, gives some of that money to the rest of the world. It was exploited from the rest of the world. It was extracted from foreign workers and foreign labor forces. It was gotten through forms of imperialism, war profiteering, and so on. International aid is the minimum a country like the United States can do. And I would say in a general sense, it is sort of the moral imperative of a state structure, insofar as that it is inherently immoral to give away some of that money that it stole from the people, that it stole from its people in its own nation, and that it stole from the people abroad. So international aid is just kind of a no-brainer. It both has a moral case for it, but also has a cynical, Machiavellian case for it. So international aid is not a waste of money. That is just kind of this shallow-brained thinking of right-wingers who haven't even thought through all of their priors and really just are trying to loudly tell you, I don't care about other people. That's the only reason people say this. There's no actual good reason, right, left, no matter what, that you should really believe international aid is a waste of money. Strongly disagree. Question 25 of 70. My nation is great. So here, we'd have to qualify, what is the nation? Is the nation its people? Is the nation the state? Is the nation the land itself? Because my answers would differ depending on each of these. However, I have to regard that the writers of this test probably aren't thinking in that kind of nuanced way. When they're talking about the nation, they are talking about the state. They're talking about the combination of state power and all of the traditions and cultural aspects of that society. And in that sense, no, my nation is not great. In fact, I live in a nation that is one of the worst nations on the face of the planet. Not at all one of the best nations on the planet, one of the worst nations on the face of the planet. The United States is essentially a criminal entity. It is going around depriving the people of the planet. It is installing puppet governments. It is constantly intervening in the affairs of other nations and imposing itself in political situations it shouldn't be in. No, the United States as a nation, as a state construct, is not great. Quite the opposite. It is one of the least great of all nations on earth. Now, if what you meant was our culture, I think that there's a lot of great culture in the United States. It has a rich culture, a rich history, many bad things, but also many, many good things to it. The people, I love the people of the United States. I know that many people from abroad may not feel that way, but you come here and you meet people and you're going to find that the people of the United States are people just like anybody else. I care about them. I want the best for them. Truly, deeply, I want the best for the people of the United States. And insofar as by nation we mean the land itself, the United States is beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful places you'll ever go to. It's enormous. It has so many different locales. So I love the United States as the people and the place and even much of its culture, but I don't think that's what this question means. So what I'm going to say is strongly disagree. Question 26 of 70. Research should be conducted on an international scale. Yes, this is absolutely what the sciences have taught us. research that is kept too nationalized, that is too localized, is going to be less good than research which spans across the planet. The more scientists are involved in a research project, generally, the better, because you have more eyes on your projects. You have more people peer reviewing all of the papers, all of the experiments that are being done, lots of people trying to do reproduction studies, lots of different nations dumping money into the research. Research absolutely should be conducted on an international scale. And in fact, if you try to silo off science too much into national boundaries, you will find that scientists will naturally break those boundaries in order to collaborate with other scientists across the planet because of the absolute necessity of getting the best and brightest to work on the issues that face humanity. So strongly agree. Question 27 of 70, governments should be accountable to the international community. Well, yes, absolutely. And I would say that that's true in a general sense, whether by government you mean state, which this quiz does, or by government you just mean any form of, civil administration of society, which of course that could be more horizontal by nature. But insofar as that the state exists and the state is a hierarchical power structure and therefore has every impetus to abuse its power, has every reason to become imperialistic and exploitative, then absolutely you need them to be accountable to one another. So that for me is just a bygone conclusion. Question 28 of 70. Even when protesting an authoritarian government, violence is not acceptable. Yeah, no, totally disagreed. I think that what is considered violence is very much going to be gatekept by any sort of government structure. They are going to decide conveniently for themselves what is and is not violence. I think that most of us recognize as a baseline that violence is something that's done to people, or at least living things. Well, notice that when protesters start protesting, now this definition of violence includes property, it includes streets, it includes shop windows. Like all at once, now violence has a new definition. Now it's been expanded to include things, not conscious things, just things. This is because what is defined as violence is going to be whatever is convenient for prevailing power structures. So it does not make much sense to say that protesters should have to stay within those strictly policed boundaries of what the state considers violence. Furthermore, I think we all agree that when a government becomes tyrannical enough, that we all would agree with an armed overthrow of that government. This is a generally accepted precept of almost all human societies. Even in the most authoritarian societies, we all still agree with this. It's in all of our fiction. It's in all of our intuitions. Imagine, for example, the most tyrannical government you can imagine, whatever that is, like in your mind. Imagine the most tyrannical government you can imagine, and then imagine saying that you wouldn't allow the people to do an uprising to overthrow it, or you don't think it's acceptable for the people to do an uprising to coup that government. I think both me and you agree that if the government is truly tyrannical, that would be justified. So no, this one is absurd, to be honest, and really flies in the face of everyone's intuitions and the history of all human myth-making and storytelling. In fact, it goes against the fundamental precepts of how most of our states were created, is that those were created through violence directed at those hierarchical power structures. So even when protesting an authoritarian government, violence is not acceptable, strongly disagree. Question 29 of 70. My religious values should be spread as much as possible. Well, I disagree on a variety of fronts, one of them being that I am not religious, so that doesn't really make much sense for me. But I should also note that I would hope other people don't feel that way for the most part. I think that it's okay to say you think that your religion has values which people should want to partake in, and that you think that those would improve those people's lives. But I think that it is very dangerous to begin engaging in a form of zealotry or extremely forceful proselytizing. So I don't think that this is a healthy attitude, personally. Even if you are a religious person, I think you should be very careful about being too heavy-handed in trying to spread your ideology all over the planet. I think that you should be careful and considerate about how that is done for a variety of reasons. Even if your religion has many good tenets, that you should not want to see those perpetuated at any cost, that they should really only be perpetuated in a consenting fashion. So, as much as possible is very loaded, and I would say strongly disagree. Question 30 of 70. Our nation's values should be spread as much as possible. Well, I think I've already given the justification for why I strongly disagree with this question. I won't go on too long. I think I've already explained it in previous questions. So, strongly disagree. Question 31 of 70. It is very important to maintain law and order. Well, these constructs of law and order, notice how these always benefit the power structures. What is considered lawful and ordered is always us marching in lockstep, doing what our rulers tell us to do. Now, I regard, for many people who are watching this, if you don't have a more radical perspective, that may not seem intuitively true, right? You can think of laws which you believe everybody should follow, not murdering, not stealing, not committing sexual assaults. There's a variety. I think we could all agree that many of these stipulations are ones we should want to maintain in any society, okay? Agreed on that. However, what I'd like to point out is that what is and is not illegal, what is and is not ordered in a hierarchical society is always determined by those at the top of that society. Notice how when protests get inconvenient, they begin finding ways to outlaw those protests. As soon as political parties become inconvenient, they could just pass laws to get rid of those parties. What if they told you that now it was lawful to ban the parties? Is it okay because you just want to maintain law and order? Is every law just? I think we can agree that things are not just or unjust based on whether they are lawful, and that things being ordered is a matter of perspective. Whether it is ordered to be ruled by a tyrant is really depends on whether you are the tyrant or the people being ruled, doesn't it? If you are the people being ruled, I think we can all agree that it doesn't feel very ordered to be dominated by a tyrant. To the tyrant, of course, everything feels perfectly in order, but I don't think these concepts of law and order are sort of unquestionable, that they are just good, that it is very important to maintain law and order. I think it is important to maintain the human social fabric, the fabric of ethics and people doing well to one another, taking care of one another, not harming one another. That's important, not whether it is lawful for them to do so. So, strongly disagree. Don't care about that. Question 32 of 70. The general populace makes poor decisions. Well, I think this depends on the populace. It depends on the time, depends on the decisions. I think this one is very, very complicated. I think that obviously the thrust of the question, if you say yes, you support a more tyrannical style of government. And so obviously I don't support that. I do not believe that the general populace just blanket makes bad decisions. I think that if the general populace is uneducated, it will make worse decisions. I think that it also depends on the decisions, right? Like if you put a person drowning in front of the average populace, I think many people would go to help them. That would be good. However, if you, as we discussed earlier, ask them for whether they should get vaxxed or not, well, as we can see, they can be deceived. The people can be deceived. So this one is very nuanced. It's very complex. Here's what I will say. I think the general populace, if educated properly, can make the best of all decisions. Because then what you have is the accumulation of the knowledge of millions or billions of people. And that is far superior to the knowledge of a small group of people who are sitting in the state, who are sitting in the government, making decisions for everyone else without knowing what everyone else is going through. So the general populace makes poor decisions is so complicated, there is no way that I could stuff my answer into this question. What I'm going to say is that I just disagree, not strongly disagree, because I think that the population, when it is poorly educated and when it is brainwashed, does make poor decisions. But populace that is educated and is connected to its own dignity makes the best of all decisions. So I'm just going to put disagree. 33 of 70, physician-assisted suicide should be legal. This one is sometimes controversial, even among my viewership, but I believe that it should be legal for people to commit suicide assisted by a physician if there is good reason. And I know that sounds a little bit shocking. I know that might especially be a little bit jarring for people that are currently in Canada. I know this is a big issue in Canada right now, and that there are very much a lot of abuses of this system currently taking place. But I'll just give my own personal perspective, and that is that I grew up with a sister who had a wasting muscular disease called Friedreich's ataxia. She slowly had her body rot away. She couldn't walk for the majority of her life. She had no friends. She was miserable. She was depressed. She saw no future in her life. She did not live a good life. It was not better for her to be forced to live. And it's understandable that maybe you're afraid of the possibility that, if it's put in place, it will be abused, and people who don't want to die will be encouraged to, and people who don't deserve to die, the system will be abused to do a form of eugenics. That's understandable. But I do have to say that there are people for which it is not better to live than die. There are lives which are so miserable that you may not be able to conceive, that are so miserable that it is absolutely better to be dead than alive. However, the problem is, and I think we all agree, is that sometimes people aren't in the right headspace to make that decision, right? A lot of people, when they're deeply depressed, they think that's true. And I just want to say to all of you who are listening, who maybe are deeply depressed right now, don't take that as me giving you affirmation that means it's a good idea. Go through with it, because that's not what I believe at all. In fact, I think the problem is that depression convinces you of all kinds of very unhealthy things. So that depression may very well convince you to do so when your life could quite possibly get better. And a lot of the time, depression gets you so sunk in a hole that you can't really see out of the hole. Even if you're not that deep into the hole, or even if you are deep into the hole, you can crawl out a lot of the time. Even most of the time, I would say. It is possible to get into a state that is not like the one you are currently experiencing. So, as shocking as it may sound, I don't think that I would support suicide just for a depressive disorder. So, depression is not a good reason, because that can change over the course of a person's life. And I've talked with many people who, in a very deep and dark and depressive state, thought that they should try to commit suicide. And then they, one day were not depressed anymore and were very glad they had failed. Very, very glad they had failed. And it's not just one occasion, it's many occasions I've met people who have been in this position. So I just want to say that I think this one is also very nuanced. I think that, obviously I didn't even mention the example of people who are very elderly and they're in their last days. I think even in that situation, we kind of all agree, if you're already on life support and it's obvious you're going to die, speeding up that process also doesn't seem like there's any moral difficulty here. So I find this to be a very complex subject. It's understandable how people on all sides of this subject would have a knee-jerk emotional reaction. And notice how that even when I present my perspective, I present it from a personalized and subjective perspective. So I recognize that there is the risk of governments abusing this ability. This, to a lot of people might look like giving the government the ability to essentially mete out the death sentence to undesirables. And once again, understandable, especially if you're living in Canada. I understand that right now this is a very active topic, but I still do believe that physician-assisted suicide should be legal under certain circumstances. Question 34 of 70. The sacrifice of some civil liberties is necessary to protect us from acts of terrorism. And this one probably made a lot more sense, in the early 2000s. This is something that people used to talk about all the time. But now that we've really lived through the outcomes, especially here in the United States, we've seen how this ideology played out. There is no reason to believe this at this point. All that happened was we sacrificed our civil liberties, but it didn't really protect us from any acts of terrorism. In fact, there have been studies done on the subject to see if there had been, after all of this escalation of the police state, if there had been any prevention of these acts of terrorism. And the answer is no. There's not been a single example of an act of terrorism. Sorry, my cat is currently laying on my keyboard. Okay, you can't just do that, bro. Oh, you're so cute, little baby. Sorry. But no, there has been zero acts of terrorism stopped by this enormous escalation of the police state. All it did was escalate the police state. I mean, look at how many domestic shootings we have here in the United States. Has sacrificing our civil liberties done us a single bit of good? It hasn't. Absolutely not. So, absurd. We should never in any state, especially given that we live under states where they're highly abusive and want to take away all of our civil rights as fast as possible, we should never sacrifice a single scrap of what has been given to us by those states. We should always remind them that the repercussion for taking our civil liberties away is revolution. So it is not necessary to protect us from acts of terrorism. Strongly disagree. Question 35 of 70. We are finally halfway through. Government surveillance is necessary in the modern world. Disagreed. I mean, this one very much the same justification as the last one. Government surveillance has really not made us any safer. It has just deepened the control that the government has over everything in society. For example, right now, I'm looking into this camera and I can't be certain, given what we have learned about PRISM and all of the government surveillance systems, that this camera is not recording me on a daily basis, or that this mic is not recording me on a daily basis, or that my phone is not recording me on a daily basis. In fact, all disclosures all the way back from about the Obama era suggest that they are constantly recording every phone conversation and every text message, and that if they want, they can activate any camera and any mic on any computer in the entire nation. And in fact, we now know that they were spying even on foreign government officials with these tools. So no, absolutely not necessary. And us allowing them to do that really just helped create a more tyrannical and dystopian government that we are now seeing further repercussions of. Strongly disagree. Question 36 of 70. The very existence of the state is a threat to our liberty. That I agree with. Strongly agree. The state is a hierarchical power structure. Hierarchical power structures, they don't want you to have liberties. Hierarchical power structures want slaves. Every hierarchical power structure wishes to concentrate power in the hands of the few people who benefit from it. Okay. They do not want to, give you rights. They don't want to allow you to have protections from anything that they do. They want to concentrate as much power as possible. They want to suppress as much dissent as possible. Our liberty, our freedom actually comes from suppressing hierarchical power structures. We should hope to see every hierarchical power structure dismantled and replaced with a society where the people make decisions. And I don't just mean an individualistic society where we all just do as we will. I mean to say a society that is governed by us through systems of horizontal government. Okay? Horizontal governance, if that makes sense. I'm just trying to speak to a general audience here. My viewers know that this word government is contentious, but to those of you who maybe aren't in the know here, I'll just speak kind of in a way that you'll understand. A horizontal system of governments, like a direct democracy. Imagine that, these are situated in every neighborhood, in every city, at every single scale. There are forms of direct democratic engagement, and that these are how decisions are made. This is the alternative to hierarchical power structures. That is a system where we have freedom. That is a system where we make decisions. Okay, freedom is that broad capability to act. That is the system where we would have the broadest capability to act. Certainly not a system where we are ruled over by a hierarchical power structure, where a narrow group of rulers, the rich and those in positions of power, get to make decisions for us, which really benefit them. And if that ever exists for any period of time without being, undermined by the interests of oligarchs, it is just a matter of time. That is always a fraught affair. The hierarchical power structure itself is the flaw which leads to oligarchy. Every hierarchical power structure tends towards oligarchy on a long enough time scale. Therefore, if you want to protect freedom and liberty, you must oppose the state. The state is that thing which disempowers you from control over your civil affairs as a society. So the very existence of the state is a threat to our liberty. Strongly agree. Question 37 of 70. Regardless of political opinions, it is important to side with your country. Well, I think that by this point in the quiz, you already know that I'm going to disagree with this one. Why should I side with my country if my country is wrong? Why should I side with my country if it is engaged in imperialism? If it is exploiting its own workers? If it is abusing its citizenry? If it is imprisoning dissidents? There is no reason why the default should be to side with your country if your country is the villain of the planet. And here I should add, country is a very sort of ambiguous term, right? So, what is meant by country? All those things I listed for what could be meant by nation, sometimes those are what is meant by country. So a country could be your people. The country could be the land. Here, I just want to say country in a general sense usually means your nation, usually means the state power, which determines all of your civil administrative affairs. I absolutely do not side with that entity. Even, however, if it was meant, siding with just the people in your country, just within those national boundaries, if it just meant the people and the land, I still wouldn't say it is most important to side with my country. For example, if there was some situation where, my country could press a button, launch a nuke, and kill 90% of the rest of the planet's population, and somehow it would help us enormously, I would not say that I should press the nuke. I mean, that's just clearly ridiculous. That's a selfish way of thinking. That is a way of thinking which is destructive to all of the project of life. So no, I do not think that it is a bygone conclusion that you should always side with your country. I am, I must say, internationalist. I care about all of humanity and the entire ecosphere, all living things. That's what I care about. So no, I do not side with my country over the interests of all other people on earth and all other living things on earth. Absolutely not. So strongly disagree. Question 38 of 70. All authority should be questioned. I think, given everything I've said so far, that it's pretty obvious that I strongly agree. Authority, insofar as it exists, and once again, this is one of these words where there's a lot of different conceptions of it. Authority could just mean expertise, in which case, yes, you should question expertise, but you should also trust when an expert tells you how things work. And if by authority we mean a hierarchical power structure, then absolutely all authorities should be questioned. Because hierarchical power structures, as we have discussed, tend to only look out for themselves. On a long enough timeline, they always produce oligarchy. So yes, all authority should be questioned. Strongly agree. Question 39 of 70. A hierarchical state is best. This one's confusing to me because all states are hierarchical. That is what the state is. The state is a hierarchical organizational style for all civil administrative affairs. It is that body by which the people are alienated from control over society. So a hierarchical state is, redundant. You don't need to say both of those. The state is hierarchical. That being said, I get what they're trying to say here. They're basically talking about a very authoritarian state, a state where power is very concentrated in the hands of very few people. They're talking about a very tyrannical state. They're talking about a state where there is a lot of power concentrated at the top, in which case I strongly disagree. Question 40 of 70. It is important that the government follows the majority opinion, even if it is wrong. Yes, well, I agree. And I agree mostly because the government is really not in the right place to determine whether or not they are wrong. The government itself is generally, and once again, by government, I'm assuming we mean state here, is in a position of making decisions based on the perspective of those governmental operatives, the people that are in those positions of power. And their ability to determine what is right from what is wrong is not very good. They're very distant from the affairs on the ground, and generally they are not experts. Generally, they are sycophants. They are suck-ups. They are the sort of person who got there because they are willing to please massive donors, or they're willing to please the party apparatus. They're willing to fall in line. Those people are not the sort of people you want making decisions about what is right and wrong. So the government should do what the majority opinion is, but I should add, we would hope that that was a massive majority. Now, I understand the question has stipulated that the majority is wrong here. And I would hope to see there be protections in any society's constitutional documents. And once again, I know my viewers might have a problem with this word constitution, but I'm talking about a founding charter of society. It should lay out protections against the worst excesses of what is being discussed there. Absolutely societies can be racist. Absolutely societies can be xenophobic. Absolutely societies can be transphobic, and so on and so on and so on. Patriarchal and all the things you might imagine. That can happen for certain. But that's why I would hope to see there be protections at the baseline charter of society. So I would not want a society where people make wrong decisions in mass, but I also don't really trust a society where there is a small group of rulers who gets to make a decision about whether the masses are right or wrong and somehow vetoes that position. Instead, I would like to see some sort of founding document with a platform which defines the agreements that everybody within that society agree to and agree to abide by in the decisions they make. So I would say this, in fact, might I add, if you were to right now institute majority opinion in the United States, you would not get a Trumpian fascist dictatorship. Remember that the Trump voters are not half the nation. They are like 20%, 20 or 30% of the nation. Okay? About a third of the nation doesn't vote, and about a third of the nation is Republican, and about a third is Democrat, okay? So you're in this situation where the fascists don't have a majority. If you actually look at polling data, majority support is for things like Medicare for all. It's for raising the minimum wage. It's for a bunch of very progressive policies, okay? So even in the United States, where people are deeply badly educated, where people have, in fact, miseducation, brainwashing, they still mostly just want progressive social policies. If you were to put majoritarianism into action right now in the United States, you would basically get a social democracy out of it. That's what you would get. So I am much more comfortable with majority opinion than any form of state rulership. Question 41 of 70. The stronger the leadership, the better. Well, once again, we're in this situation where what is leadership? Is leadership a form of authoritarian rule where the very few get to make decisions for everyone else? Is leadership a position of decision making, or is leadership an ideological position? Is someone a leader because they get to determine what everybody else must do, or is a leader really just a person who is a visionary, who understands the circumstances, who people look up to as being wise and making good decisions? Because if the latter, yeah, in fact, we want as many leaders as possible if that's the case. And we want them all to be very good leaders. That is the best possible outcome. So this one is very weird, but unfortunately, in the context of the test, I'm imagining that leadership, wow, my cats are destroying things in the kitchen right now. I'm imagining that leadership is being made synonymous with authoritarian rule. So a strong leader would be a leader which is vested with a great deal of authority or decision-making power. And in that sense, I disagree. Obviously, for reasons I've discussed. But I'm a little bit hesitant because I don't want to give an answer that's inconsistent with my beliefs. But here I'm going to put disagree only because I don't want to confuse the test about my leanings about authority. So here I'm going to put disagree. I'm not going to put strongly disagree because I don't really want to deal with the consequences of messing up my results if it does something unexpected. Question 42 of 70. Democracy is more than a decision-making process. I think this is true in a sense. I think that a society that is highly democratic is one that also has democratic social norms. And that is a lot of the things that I've discussed about having good education, about people being involved in decision-making, about people being proactive about learning and engaging in decision-making. But personally, I do think that democracy is mostly just a decision-making process. However, there are many kinds of democratic decision-making processes. There is a representative form of democracy, there is direct democracy, there is consensus democracy, there's all kinds of democratic forms of decision-making. So this one's really weird because I'm not sure what it's getting at, but I think what it's saying is like, democracy also entails a culture. And so in that sense, I would say agree, because I'm really not sure what the question's getting at. So we're going to put agree on this one and we're going to move on. Question 43 of 70. Environmental regulations are essential. Well, I've given a lot of reasons as to why I believe this in previous questions. And that is to say that if you do not regulate industry, they are just going to go wild, extracting as much profit as is conceivably possible. They do not care about the long-term future. They do not care about the repercussions to the environment. They do not care about how many animals they kill or how much of the ecosphere that they destroy. All they care about is making money right now. It is incredibly short-term thinking that governs the economy. And with that in mind, yeah, insofar as the state and capital continue to exist, environmental regulations are absolutely essential to prevent corporations from destroying the planet and absolutely devastating all of the localities we have to live in. Because you know what? All these corporations, they don't care about the places we have to live. They will destroy our environments. They'll only take care of their environments. They'll take care of the places they live, okay? Those places will be beautiful, but the places we live, they don't care. They don't care if the places we live have no water in our water tables. They only care about their profits. So this is one of those many places where the state absolutely has to step in and regulate industry. Environmental regulations are essential. Strongly agree. Question 44 of 70. A better world will come from automation, science, and technology. Well, I think that automation, science, and technology will be involved in building a better world, but I don't think that all we have to do is automate, implement science and technology, and we'll just get a better world. What we have learned from history is that all of these things can be utilized by our rulers. So capitalists implemented the new steam technology of the late 1800s and the science that was being discovered at that time. And forms of automation are already being used to kick people out of their jobs and prevent people from being able to utilize the skills that they have in industry. So it's clearly not the case that technology and science and automation getting better just leads to a liberatory world. However, it's clearly also the case that automation, science, and technology will be utilized in order to build a society which needs less labor from the people and therefore more abundance with less labor. So this one's a little bit weird because I think it's just worded in a way that makes it maybe a little bit more unclear. But I think that what it's really trying to say is that those things will be involved in making a better world. So I would agree with that. Question 45 of 70, children should be educated in religious or traditional values. I'll just say right off the bat, I strongly disagree with this. I think that including religious and traditional values in children's education is really just a form of brainwashing. There's really no reason why this should be part of our baseline education. Now, if what's meant by traditional values is just the values of the society that we are living in, and that society were a better society, some sort of liberatory society, then I guess that would be good. But even then, I would say traditional values, that is not a good characterization of what I think should be taught in schools. As for religious values, even if I were somebody that held more religious views, I still would not think it was a good idea. I still think that education should be secular. There are too many religions for us to narrow down a particular religion being taught in our schools. So that is to say that we probably just shouldn't be teaching about any specific religion in our schools. Wow, the cat really, I don't know if you can hear that on the mic, but the cat really wants me to go in there and turn on the faucet. So that's what I'm going to do. Also, this just kind of strikes me as being a dog whistle for like fascist educational styles. So here I'm going to put strongly disagree. Question 46 of 70, traditions are of no value on their own. Yeah, I 100% strongly agree with this one. Traditions aren't good just because they're traditions. Traditions are good insofar as that they promote some form of healthy social value. That is to say, if they create some form of camaraderie, if they create social cohesion, if they lead to people having pro-social behaviors, if they tell us about our history, things like that. If a tradition does that and doesn't have a bunch of negative downsides, I should say, then I would say that it has value. But traditions have no value on their own in and of themselves just because they are traditions. Question 47 of 70, religion should play a role in government. Religion should not have any distinct role in government, in my opinion. That is not to say that people's religious values may not be important in government, but governments should generally be secular. That is to say, they should not have a commitment to any particular religion. All this does is it leads to a form of religious supremacy. So question 48 of 70, churches should be taxed the same way other institutions are taxed. Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with this wholeheartedly. I really see no reason why churches should be exempt from taxation. This whole separation of church and state was meant to protect the state from being infiltrated by religious interests, not so that churches could avoid all social responsibility and essentially be free from any sort of imposition by state regulation. In fact, churches have been violating this agreement of the separation of church and state for a long time now. Churches are explicitly political. They are always promoting the candidacy of all kinds of Republican candidates. They are donating enormous amounts of money to those candidates. There is really no way we can conceive that churches are outside of the political process somehow. And they are certainly not outside of the economic process. They should 100% be taxed, and that money should be put towards social programs. Question 49 of 70, climate change is currently one of the greatest threats to our way of life. Yeah, I mean, I would only alter this to say that it is possibly the greatest threat to our way of life. Climate change is destroying the planet. We are in the middle of a mass extinction, and it is only going to get worse. That means that it is going to be harder to grow crops. That means that our water tables are going to become more and more polluted, and that is just what is left of them. They are being drained daily. It is producing more and more famines. It is leading to wide-scale devastation of the planet. People are already experiencing the repercussions of climate change in an enormous way, and it's only going to get worse. You know, you look around and you see wildfires across the planet. You see the exacerbation of all kinds of natural weather cycles which already existed. Our hurricanes are worse. Our tornadoes are worse. All kinds of climates which had been that way for a very long period of time are shifting where they are located. And in the next few decades, we can probably expect to see even more devastating outcomes. So climate change may be the greatest existential threat to every living thing on the planet. So, strongly agree. Question 50 of 70. It is important that we work as a united world to combat climate change. Yeah, there's really not much of an alternative. Climate change is not something that can just be separated up into national boundaries. I think this is a big reason why that the right wing hates climate change so much. It means that they are going to have to not only change the economic behaviors of a bunch of people that they're in the pockets of, that is, say, big oil, big coal, etc., but they're also going to have to work with other nations, and they are nationalists who only really care about their own nation, and more even than that, they only care about their own state. So it really is very frustrating to them to be exposed to something which demonstrates that we are all actually in this together, that there is no way to live this individualistic, nationalistic fever dream that they want to put in place. And so, yeah, that's why the right wing despises climate change as a subject, because it exposes the delusion of their thinking. And so, absolutely, we must work as a united world to combat climate change. Question 51 of 70. Society was better many years ago than it is now. Well, it kind of depends on where you look. Like some places, maybe they were better than it is now, but a lot of places were worse than it is now. I think that the internet has definitely boiled people's brains, especially social media. I think that a lot of technologies have been misused by the prevailing power structures, corporations, and states to make our lives worse and more atomized. They have destroyed our third spaces. We are working through retirement. They have essentially destroyed the ability of unions to form together and collectively bargain. They have created a society where everyone is miserable and afraid, and that is absolutely worse than it was just a few decades ago. But things were getting worse just a few decades ago. People were just kind of living delusionally during that period of time. So it's not that things actually were better, it's that people were more delusional during that period of time because the propaganda has succeeded in convincing people that things were better. So in a purely superficial sense, yeah, maybe. And if you were to look back to perhaps many societies that were living before the expansion of hierarchical power across the planet, some of those societies were definitely living in a better way in many ways. They had closer ties to their friends and family. Their village communities were much more closely knit. People had a sense of meaning and belonging. But I would probably still personally not choose to live in those societies. They didn't have most of the common amenities we currently have. People died much more often from sickness. Children died in childbirth much more often. So I can't really look to the past as a model for the future. I'm definitely somebody who always wants to move forward, and the society I want to live in is one that lies in the future. So I disagree that society was better many years ago than it is now. There are aspects of it which were better. It's not as if that our solution lies in going backwards. Question 52 of 70. It is important that we maintain the traditions of our past. Well, I've kind of already made my opinions on this clear. I don't care about traditions for their own sake. I only care about traditions insofar as they foster some sort of pro-social values. So I don't care about maintaining the traditions of the past for their own sake. Disagree that it is important. Question 53 of 70. It is important that we think in the long term beyond our lifespans. Yes, it is crucially important. In fact, when we don't think beyond our lifespans, if we do not think into the future, we are just going to lead to devastating consequences. Short-term thinking is the thinking of a parasite. It is an extractive mindset. It is about benefiting oneself at the expense of others. It is about taking as much as you can. It is about ripping the copper out of the walls, even though somebody's going to live in that house afterwards. You know, there's this concept in Native society of the 7 generations principle, and that is that you're supposed to be planning 7 generations ahead. The plans that you are making now are those which are going to be conducive to the lives of people 7 generations from you. And I think that is the only way to live in a conducive way with the environment and with future peoples. That is also the way where we set up things that better society. That is a way where we live in a progressive manner in communion with other people in society. That is the way that we give to our children and to our grandchildren and so on and so on and so on. If we don't, we will destroy everything. And the boomers basically demonstrated this. Greed is not an ethos, it is a pathos. It leads to the destruction of everything. It is the ideology of a cancer. So, yeah, it is important that we think in the long term beyond our lifespans. Question 54 of 70. Reason is more important than maintaining our culture. I think I've pretty much already made the case for this. Reason, that is to say, looking at things through empirical evidence, through logic, through rational consideration of the world, by looking for a progressive demonstration of the truth of our values, that is what leads to a better society, not just maintaining culture. Cultures contain all kinds of things within them, both pro-social and antisocial values. So just maintaining culture for its own sake means maintaining all kinds of antisocial behaviors, which are really not good for the flourishing of society and certainly do not lead to progress. So yeah, reason is more important than maintaining culture. Strongly agree. Question 55 of 70. Drug use should be legalized or decriminalized. Yeah, as somebody that believes in bodily autonomy, I do not think that a hierarchical power structure especially should be telling you what you can do with your body. I think that you have responsibility for your behaviors after you have consumed those drugs, but that the state should not be able to tell you that you cannot consume those drugs. That is up to you, and you have a responsibility to do that safely, to not harm yourself, to not harm those you love, and to not harm society in general. But the state should not have a place in determining what you do to your body. So absolutely, within the paradigm of the state, drugs should be legalized or decriminalized. Strongly agree. Question 56 of 70. Same-sex marriage should be legal. This is back to bodily autonomy. That has no effect on anybody but you. Your decision about who you marry, who you love, who you enter into any kind of relationship with, that is down to your personal liberty. And other people should not be able to determine what you do consentingly with other adults. So the idea that the state or any other entity should have any decision making in what kind of relationship you enter into with any other adult human being is absurd and is frankly contrary to all of the necessary values that lead to a good society. Same-sex marriages have no negative effects on society, so there's no good reason for us to try to place any kind of restrictions around who a consenting adult chooses to enter into a relationship with. So same-sex marriage absolutely should be legal. Question 57 of 70. No cultures are superior to others. I think this one's kind of weird because, when people often kind of disagree with this statement, it's from a supremacist standpoint. That is to say, they are defending white supremacist conceptions that, white culture, European culture is better than African culture or something. But I think we can actually agree that there are better cultures insofar as that white supremacist culture is inferior to many other cultures on the planet. So there certainly are cultures that are better than others. However, what we desire to do as a functioning society is we desire to create a sort of polyvalent society, a society where many different perspectives, many different cultures are allowed to flourish alongside one another. So that is to say, we want a society where every culture that is able to collaborate or able to cooperate with other cultures should be allowed to exist or should be encouraged to flourish. And those cultures which demand supremacy, which demand a single homogenizing set of values, those are the cultures which should be pushed out of society. Those are the cultures that should be marginalized. But that is not really up to me, and it is really not up to any sort of state structure. Cultures are something that come about by the volition of a people's, not by the decision of a power structure. So here I'm just going to put neutral because I think you can hear that this is sort of a nuanced subject. So I think what they're looking for here is for people that have a more cosmopolitan perspective to say, yeah, no cultures are superior to others because they're used to supremacists trying to claim that the supremacist culture is better than some other culture, which is seen as some kind of degenerate culture. But I would say that a supremacist culture is inferior to other cultures. So this one is a little bit hard to answer. I will say it's either neutral or agree because, I want to say agree because I'm trying to give it the understanding that I have a cosmopolitan understanding, an understanding that we're looking for a sort of polyvalent culture. We're looking for, a pluralistic culture. But yeah, I'm going to put neutral because it's kind of hard to convey that idea to this test. Question 58 of 70. Sex outside marriage is immoral. Well, there is no good reason to believe this. There is nothing immoral about who you have sex with or when you have sex with them insofar as you are two consenting adults. Marriage really does not determine whether something is ethical or not ethical to do. I mean, think about the arbitrariness of this. Sex directly before getting married to someone is somehow immoral, but then an hour later, you two have gone through a ceremony and somehow the same act is moral. This is just a nonsensical position to hold unless you have some kind of supernatural religious values which give value to that marriage ceremony or the act of commitment itself. However, historically, the reason why marriage is connected to this form of judgment about sexual impropriety is actually just that this is a form of social control. Power structures want to make sure that people only reproduce if they can be model citizens and can take care of the child in a way which is conducive for the state. However, you can have sex and not have a child. And furthermore, sex and its relation to marriage really has nothing to do with morality. The only thing we really are concerned about in this concept is if two people have a child, we would hope to see them take care of that child and be good parents to that child. But marriage is in no way a good indicator of whether they will be good to that child. So my answer is sex outside marriage is morally neutral. It really has no moral value one way or another. Strongly disagree. Question 59 of 70. If we accept migrants at all, it is important that they assimilate into our culture. No, I don't really care if they assimilate into our culture. That's not really important to me. I do care if they act in a way which is moral or immoral, but I also am really not interested in moralizing about immigrants as a generalized population. I think that the worry about immigrants and their inherent immorality is mostly just a fascist talking point. In fact, even if you use law abidance as an important value, immigrants commit crimes at a lower rate than citizens. And you can go look that up. Immigrants are more law-abiding than citizens. So if your conception is that law-abiding people are more valuable, well, then immigrants are more valuable than the average citizen. They commit fewer crimes than the average citizen. As far as them assimilating into our culture, I don't really care. I am in support of a society where we have a pluralistic culture. So I've already explained that, so I'm not going to belabor the point. I don't care if they assimilate into our culture. Strongly disagree. Question 60 of 70. Abortion should be prohibited in most or all cases. Abortion, in my opinion, should never be prohibited. I think that it is another issue of bodily autonomy. The person who is having the child should be able to determine whether that they would want to have a child. All of the moral issues around abortion are just right-wingers trying to punish women for having children and trying to discourage people from having sex outside of marriage. And that is because they despise bodily autonomy. They want complete population control. They want to be certain that everybody follows their religious doctrines. This is just a way for them to shoehorn religious values into government. It has nothing to do with actual moral values. It has everything to do with Christian fundamentalists trying to control the bodies of women, because to control the bodies of women is to reinforce patriarchal and therefore hierarchical values in society. So abortion should not be prohibited in any cases, in my opinion. I strongly disagree. Question 61 of 70. We're in the home run here. Gun ownership should be prohibited for those without a valid reason. I disagree with this one because pretty much everybody has a valid reason while we live in a hierarchical society. While we are living in a hierarchical society, everyone has the reason of resisting a tyrannous government. There is always a good reason to have a gun when you live under oppression, when your rulers are constantly extracting labor value from you, constantly exploiting you in a variety of ways, oppressing you, pushing you into ghettos, using you for every little thing that you can give them, and then throwing you away in old age. Insofar as that this is the sort of society we live in, everybody should be allowed to have a gun because guns will be needed to overthrow the government if the time comes. That being said, I do think there are certain situations where people would be dangerous if they had a gun. I think that people who have demonstrated that they are ready to harm others on a regular basis, people who are, for example, serial domestic abusers, people who are child abusers, even people, I would say, who have demonstrated some form of suicidality based on depression. I think that might be unhealthy for them to have firearms. But even then, in that last one, I would say that people who have depression should still be able to own firearms. Lots of depressed people have owned firearms, and that has not made them kill themselves. I know this is a controversial opinion internationally, but I think that America's actually got this one right. I think that the idea of disarming ourselves when the world is full of states which are predicated upon the tyrannical ruling of their people is absurd and benefits the states that we live under. I think even Marx regarded this fact that the proletariat should not surrender their arms under any circumstances. However, for some reason, we live under an international conception, even among many leftists, that we shouldn't be armed. This is bizarre to me, but I think that American leftists have this one right. Gun ownership should not be prohibited for nearly any reason except for a person has demonstrated consistent violent behaviors, trying to harm others, trying to murder people, getting into fights and things like that on a regular basis, going out to the bar and getting into fights and almost killing people and so on. That should be the only reason, really. So strongly disagree on this one. Question 62 of 70. I support single-payer universal healthcare. Well, this one is already answered, I think, by one of the really early questions. I think this is just one of those basic amenities every society should provide, and it should be single-payer and universal because preferencing people based upon their wealth or their access is extremely dangerous. It only benefits people in positions of rulership. It only benefits the wealthy, and it harms those who are at the bottom of the ladder. Whereas a single payer universal healthcare just means that there is a standard of care that everyone gets, and it works way better in every society it is being practiced. The American system of healthcare is garbage. And everywhere where there's a single payer universal healthcare, it is working better than the United States. So absolutely, I support single payer universal healthcare. Strongly agree. Question 63 of 70, prostitution should be illegal. I disagree. I think that sex work is a valid form of work. I see no issue with a person engaging in sex work. I think that it should be decriminalized across the board globally. I think that what we should be looking at, however, is this word prostitution. So this word prostitution in many occasions suggests that there is a sort of a pimp relationship, that someone is pimping the person who is engaged in prostitution. I'm absolutely against that. I'm against anybody pimping a prostitute. That is a hierarchical power structure. If a person wants to do sex work, that is their right, and that is just another form of productive labor, in my opinion. But if they are instead being forced to engage in it because of some coercive activity by a pimp, that is absolutely unacceptable. Obviously, sex trafficking is completely unacceptable, but I consider that to be a separate issue. And here I take this word prostitution to just mean sex work. I do not take it to be the specific examples I gave of a person being pimped or sex trafficked. So I strongly disagree with this. Question 64 of 70. Maintaining family values is essential. Here we are on another one of those where I don't care about it for its own sake. I do not care about quote unquote family values for their own sake. I care about whether those family values are pro-social or not. If those family values are predicated upon patriarchy, domination of the wife and submission, and her being forced into a housewife position, children being forced to submit to the father no matter how cruel or indifferent he is to their suffering, I don't care to maintain any of this. If these are the family values somebody's talking about, I am for abolishing them tomorrow. If what is meant by family values is caring about and loving your siblings, looking after your parents when they are elderly, things like this, I think these are healthy. These are pro-social values. But I don't care about maintaining family values just for the sake of maintaining quote-unquote family values. So this phrase, family values, is just kind of loaded. I'm just going to put disagree here because I don't even know what they mean by quote unquote family values. Or maybe I should put neutral. I'm going to put disagree. Question 65 of 70. To chase progress at all costs is dangerous. Well, I mean, I would agree insofar as that we'd have to qualify what progress is, right? If what we mean, for example, is progress in our technology, yeah, that's clearly the case. Look at the nuclear bomb as an example. But usually this talking point is utilized by conservatives. What's really going on is just conservatives always trying to foresee some imaginary risk of giving people equal rights, of giving value to people who are not part of the sort of homogenous mainstream culture. They're trying to hold back people who have non-conforming gender identities or who don't want to follow the beaten path, who see things differently. That is what the general concern of people is when they are concerned with progress. However, I do think that there are examples where what we might consider progress does lead to negative outcomes, and these are often in the form of knowledge hazards, and these can occur for sure in science. So scientists have to be careful about what they develop, and they have to also have ethical standards for the development of new practices. But my intuition here is just that this one is essentially trying to figure out how conservative I am. I'm going to put that chasing progress at all costs is not dangerous, but I'm only going to just put disagree because I don't want to give the idea that I am conservative when I am not. I think that there are valid concerns to be had about progress at all costs when not considering possible externalities, but I also think this is mostly in practice just a talking point of the far right. Question 66 of 70 says, genetic modification is a force for good, even on humans. This one is an enormous can of worms. I think that genetic modification on food is widely misunderstood and that GMOs are good and they are generally leading to a better world for everyone. So genetic modification has been an enormous mover in people being fed and healthy all over the planet. We have added all kinds of gene sequences to plants, which has made them more nutrient rich in places where that is the only food they had access to. So we've prevented all kinds of forms of malnutrition and starvation by doing so, also making them more prolific in their growth. I think that when it comes to humans, that we have a pretty serious bodily autonomy issue. And that is to say, if we set some standard for the sorts of genetic predispositions that we are not going to allow people to be born with, then we create a structure by which the state can determine people being born or not being born with specific traits. I think that if there was a world where we had a responsible usage of this sort of genetic modification, that it would be great to eradicate things like Friedreich's ataxia or muscular dystrophy, or all kinds of wasting diseases, all kinds of terrible disabilities that nobody would say they wanted to be born with. And I think we could probably determine what these are by just polling people. There are sicknesses, I guarantee you, where if you went and you polled every person who had that sickness, 100% of them would say they wish they weren't born with it. And for those sicknesses, those should be prevented. Nobody should ever have those sicknesses for the rest of human existence. So I could say, yes, it is a force of good in those occasions, but also I think we're all keenly aware of the dystopian possibilities of genetic modification and its relation to eugenics and the state having the power, this kind of extraordinary power of eugenics. This is only, in fact, addressing the issue of editing embryos. We haven't even gotten into the idea of editing people after birth. I think that there is one upside, is that after people are born, at least now they can exert their bodily autonomy in a positive sense. They can say what they do or do not want to engage in. And insofar as that all genetic modification was something that people could opt into, then I would be for it. I would just say that people need to be of age where we think that they can consent to that genetic modification. So this one, I will just say agree, but I do think it's very complicated. Question 67 of 70. We should open our borders to immigration. Yeah, I don't care about borders. Once again, I have no desire to maintain the United States as a sovereign nation. That's really just nowhere on my priority list. And I don't think immigration is negative for the nation. I think that immigration mostly has positives. I mean, as we were just saying earlier, immigrants literally commit crimes at a lower rate. They're willing to do all kinds of labor that people in those nations are generally not willing to do. I don't see any issue with immigration. I only see an issue with, people who migrate and do harmful things. Obviously I wouldn't want gangs to migrate, but I also think that that is an extremely overblown concern. I think that the vast majority of migration has nothing to do with gangs, has nothing to do with the drug trade, has nothing to do with any of these antisocial activities. I think that immigration, 99.999% of immigration is completely morally neutral. We should open our borders to immigration. Strongly agree. Question 68 of 70. Governments should be as concerned about foreigners as they are about their own citizens. I mean, that's kind of a lot to ask, given everything we've said about how the state functions. In a conceptual sense, yes. Obviously, if the state has any responsibility to safeguard people's needs, then we would hope that it would safeguard everyone's needs, not just the people within some specific arbitrary locality, not just the people who have won some sort of birth lottery of being born into that specific nation. And if every state followed this sort of dictum, we would be living in a much, much better world because all the states would be supporting the people of the entire planet. However, I consider this one kind of unrealistic. States don't care about their people or foreigners. States are custom-created machines to benefit the ruling class. So the idea that a state even cares about its own people is a little bit suspect. It only cares about its own people in order to extract from them. In the same way that a parasite will not keep extracting until it kills the host, usually, the same way a state is not going to keep extracting until it kills its own host. But yeah, I mean, I guess in some kind of fairy fantasy land, it would be great if governments cared as much about foreigners as they do their own citizens. I just think that's a kind of a ridiculous conception, given that states are not charitable entities. States only do what is absolutely necessary for their perpetuation, and which they must do or be overthrown as a consequence. Question 69 of 70. All people, regardless of factors like culture or sexuality, should be treated equally. Yeah, this one for me is absolutely 100% the case. I think that in order for us to have a pluralistic society, we have to be open to people of all kinds of different viewpoints coexisting with us. Now, I will make note that I do think that there are exceptions to be made for this for people that have ideologies which want to destroy a pluralistic culture. So here we are back to the paradox of tolerance. And the paradox of tolerance basically says that if you are too tolerant, you will tolerate the intolerant, and then that will lead to the end of a society of tolerance. So in that sense, there is no reason why we should be tolerant of those who have ideologies of intolerance. Those people should essentially be marginalized and banished from society to the maximal degree possible. So this has its limits, but the limits are only in getting rid of those people which disallow the perpetuation of a pluralistic society. So I would say strongly agree, because I doubt this question really cares about that nuance. Question 70 of 70, very last one. It is important that we further my group's goals above all others. Well, I think my group is an incredibly arbitrary sort of phrase. Like, what is meant by my group? Does it mean my racial group? Does it mean my gender? Does it mean the organizations that I'm part of? Which organization? My political organization? Does it mean just like when my friends get together, my friend group? What does it mean? This is too vague for me to have any sort of answer to this question, because I would give different answers on all of them. If it meant my group being my gender, no. If it meant my group being my race, no. If it meant my group meaning like revolutionaries, yeah, that's good. It benefits everyone. If it meant my friend group, no. My friend group is just a small group of people. It's not representative of the needs of others. This question is too vague to be meaningful to me, but I think what it's trying to do is not dog whistle, but give a subtle nudge towards fascists and nationalists of different sorts. So I would say disagree on this one. So here are my results. For the economic axis, I get communist, so it guessed right. I get 94.2% equality. For the diplomatic axis, I get internationalist, 86.7% globe. For the civil axis, I get anarchist, 90.2% liberty. And for the societal axis, I get revolutionary, 92.3% progress. It did a pretty good job, y'all. I mean, this is pretty accurate. Economically, I'm a communist. Diplomatically, I'm an internationalist. On the civil axis, I'm an anarchist. On the societal axis, I'm a revolutionary. It got it. I mean, the test did good. And then furthermore, we have closest match. It tries to estimate my ideology, And it nails it. Libertarian communism. So it's right. I'm a libertarian communist. That's a very good description of my position. Now, obviously, I'd have to know what other ones that they have in the list to know whether this is the best description of all of those that it could have offered. But yeah, no, I'm a libertarian communist. It got me. It nailed it perfectly. So, a few of those questions, I wasn't quite sure. I was like, oh, I don't want to give it the wrong idea or something. But no, it did good. It nailed it. So yeah, the test did a pretty good job, y'all. I actually think that even though I liked the Prism test's format a little bit better, with each answer kind of being a specific viewpoint, it nailed it. It accurately discerned that I am a libertarian communist, and on each of its key axes, it correctly assessed my positions on those topics. I suggest y'all go take this test, see where you land. Obviously you've already had your thoughts perhaps biased by what I've said as I answered the questions, but no, it's pretty good. People are always talking about the political compass and whining about the political compass. But there's better tests out there. These tests are actually pretty decent. So, go take it yourself, see what you get, and tell me what you get down in the comments. Not only, each of the percentages, but which ideology popped out as a result. Also, I want to suggest, if you have watched the video up to this point and you're not subscribed to the channel, I do stuff like this all the time on this channel. You should go down there and click subscribe. Or if you haven't liked the video, you should go and like the video. Also, don't forget that any interaction is good interaction on these videos. So whether you agree or disagree, I'm happy to have you down there in the comments. And for those of you who really support the work that I'm doing on this channel, I want to suggest you go over to my Patreon and become a patron for any amount. Any amount will not only benefit the channel enormously, but also will get you access to the Anarch Discord. Just don't forget to go into the settings and put your Discord information in there, and it will automatically invite you to the Discord. But yeah, what'd y'all think? Do you think this was a good test? I think it was definitely one of my favorites that I've taken so far. But anyway, I think that's it for this time. I'll see y'all next time.